On May 1st, 2022, a woman found a rusted barrel on the receding shore of Lake Mead, corroded enough to see inside. Decomposed human remains. Jeans and Velcro sneakers sold at Kmart in the late 1970s. The man had been shot, sealed inside, and dumped decades ago. He is still unidentified. He wasn't the only body the lake gave back that summer. There were 6. The largest reservoir in America was draining, and as the water fell, secrets meant to stay buried forever rose toward the light. That barrel had sat 100 feet underwater. What else is down there? The answer turns out to be everything. A ghost town built by Mormon pioneers, a World War II landing craft, the kind that hit the beaches at Normandy, once submerged 185 feet below the surface. A B-29 Superfortress bomber that crashed during a research flight in 1948, sank and wasn't found for half a century. Dozens of pleasure boats that slipped their moorings over the decades, swallowed by water so deep their owners never bothered to recover them. The hull of an abandoned houseboat, and below all of it, buried in silt, the concrete foundations of a schoolhouse, the stone walls of a 14-room hotel, and the charred wreckage of a home that the last citizen of a drowned town set on fire before rowing away into the rising lake. Lake Mead is not a natural lake. There is no ancient geological story here. It exists entirely because a group of men sat down in a room in Santa Fe, New Mexico on November 24, 1922, and divided the waters of the Colorado River between 7 western states. That agreement, the Colorado River Compact, was the most ambitious water-sharing deal in American history. It was promoted by Herbert Hoover, then the Secretary of Commerce. It was celebrated as visionary, and it was based on a number that was wrong. The negotiators believed the Colorado River carried roughly 16.4 million acre-feet of water per year. They drew that estimate from flow measurements taken during what turned out to be one of the wettest periods in the river's recorded history. The actual long-term average was probably closer to 14.6 million acre-feet. Some modern studies, using tree ring data going back centuries, put the true average even lower. But nobody at that table in Santa Fe had tree ring data. They had a river that looked generous, and they divided it generously. 7.5 million acre-feet a year to the upper basin states of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, and 7.5 million to the lower basin states of Arizona, California, and Nevada. A 1944 treaty later promised another 1.5 million to Mexico. Add the commitments together, and you arrive at 16.5 million acre-feet of annual promises against a river that, in the best years, barely produced 15 million. In bad years, considerably less. They had, in the most consequential miscalculation in the history of American water management, divided up a river that could not deliver what they promised. And then they spent billions of dollars building infrastructure to store and distribute the water they assumed would come. The compact was signed in the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe. Herbert Hoover chaired the session. Arizona refused to ratify. California was already building aqueducts. Nevada, with so few people in 1922 that it was barely considered a factor, received the smallest allocation, 300,000 acre-feet per year. That amount would one day supply a city of more than 2 million people in one of the hottest deserts on Earth. But nobody envisioned Las Vegas in 1922, and nobody built a mechanism into the compact to adjust the numbers if the river turned out to be less generous than it appeared. President Calvin Coolidge signed the Boulder Canyon Project Act in 1928. Construction of the dam began in 1931 in the depths of the Depression, in a canyon so hot that workers sometimes collapsed and died on the concrete. The dam rose 726 feet from the floor of Black Canyon on the Arizona-Nevada border. It consumed 3.25 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to pave a 2-lane highway from San Francisco to New York. It was the tallest dam in the world. The official dedication came on September 30th, 1935, and behind it, The Colorado River began to pool into a reservoir that would eventually stretch 112 miles through the desert, hold 26 million acre-feet of water, and supply drinking water, irrigation, and hydroelectric power to what would grow to roughly 40 million people across 7 states and northern Mexico. They named it Lake Mead after Elwood Mead, the Bureau of Reclamation commissioner who oversaw the project. At its peak employment, the dam project employed more than 5,000 workers. Over 100 men died during construction. When it was finished, the dam generated enough electricity to power Southern California, Southern Nevada, and large stretches of Arizona. Cheap, clean hydroelectric power that would help fuel the growth of Los Angeles, the rise of Las Vegas, and the agricultural empire of Arizona's Salt River Valley. It was, at the time, the single greatest engineering achievement in American history. America's largest reservoir was open for business. But the lake had to swallow something to exist. 60 miles east of Las Vegas, at the confluence of the Muddy and Virgin Rivers, sat a small farming community called St. Thomas. Mormon settlers had founded it in January 1865, led by a man named Thomas Sasson Smith. They believed they were building in Utah. A later survey placed them in Nevada. The state of Nevada, delighted to discover a new taxable community, immediately demanded back taxes. The settlers couldn't pay. The entire town packed up and moved to Utah in 1871. Others moved in. By 1918, St. Thomas had about 500 residents, a grocery store, a cafe, a post office, a school, and a hotel called the Gentry with 14 rooms. No electricity, no indoor plumbing. The place ran on farming, cattle, and the slow pace of a desert town that didn't bother anybody and didn't expect to be bothered. The people of St. Thomas lived modestly. They grew cotton, corn, and melons. They raised cattle. The Gentry Hotel served travelers passing through on the Arrowhead Trail, one of the early automobile highways linking Salt Lake City to Los Angeles. The town had survived floods, drought, a jurisdictional fight between Utah and Nevada, and 70 years of the desert's indifference. It had never been a boom town. It had never made anyone rich. It had simply persisted in the way that small western towns sometimes did, through stubbornness and the presence of water. Then the dam was authorized, and every resident of St. Thomas was told to leave. They were offered compensation. Reports suggest an average of roughly $325 per lot. Some fought, some bargained. Most packed up. The water rose slowly through the 1930s. Families dragged their houses away on skids, disassembled what they could, and left the rest. By 1938, the town was nearly empty. Hugh Lord was the last man there. On June 11th, 1938, as the rising water reached his front door, he set his house on fire and rowed away in a small boat. Within months, St. Thomas sat 60 feet below the surface of Lake Mead. The tops of its tallest cottonwood trees poked above the waterline for a while, and then they too disappeared. The lake didn't care about St. Thomas. The lake was a machine, and for decades that machine worked brilliantly. By the 1940s and 1950s, Lake Mead was already becoming one of the most popular outdoor recreation destinations in the country. The area was designated Boulder Dam Recreation Area in 1936, renamed Lake Mead National Recreation Area in 1947, the first national recreation area in the entire Park Service system. The water was warm enough to swim in for months. The desert sky was enormous. The shoreline stretched over 750 miles. Marinas opened at Boulder Harbor, Colville Bay, Echo Bay, Temple Bar. Campgrounds filled on weekends. Houseboat fleets multiplied. Fishing charters ran morning and evening. The water was teeming with largemouth bass and striped bass, and the stripers ran big, 30, 40 pounds, sometimes more. Las Vegas, just 30 miles to the northwest, was exploding in the post-war years. The Strip was going up. The Flamingo, the Sands, the Sahara, the Riviera, casino after casino rising from the desert floor. The city was hiring by the thousands, and those workers needed somewhere to go on their days off. Lake Mead became the city's backyard. Pit bosses and cocktail waitresses, construction workers and showgirls, families and retirees, they all drove the same road through the desert to the same blue water. You could play blackjack at midnight, sleep until 9, and be pulling a bass out of the lake by 10:30. On summer weekends, the marinas hummed. The smell of gasoline and sunscreen and charcoal drifted off the water. Houseboats lined up in the coves like floating subdivisions. Ski boats carved white arcs behind their wakes. Kids jumped off rocks into water so warm it felt like a bath. The proximity was everything. No other major recreational lake in the country sat this close to a city this large and this hungry for entertainment. And the combination, desert heat, deep water, cheap gas, the biggest party town in America 30 minutes up the road, made Lake Mead something unique in the national park system. Then there was the dam itself, which drew its own tourist economy. Hundreds of thousands of people a year paid to tour the dam's interior, to walk across its crest, to look down into Black Canyon and up at the reservoir that stretched to the horizon. In the best years, paid dam visitation topped 800,000 annually. The combination, the dam, the lake, the desert, the nearness of Las Vegas, made the area unlike any other park in the system. By the mid-1990s, Lake Mead National Recreation Area was one of the most visited Park Service sites in the country. In 1995, annual visitation peaked at 9.8 million. That is a staggering number. A single holiday weekend could bring 140,000 people, more than the total annual attendance at 40% of all national parks. The concessions operations around the lake were grossing about $45 million a year. The Park Service estimated the entire recreation area pumped roughly $500 million annually into the surrounding economy. The park's own budget was about $18 million, 90% of which went to paying the 220 people who kept it running. 6 boat ramps, multiple marinas, fuel docks, houseboat rentals, fishing suppliers, campgrounds, restaurants, bait shops, all of it built around one assumption: the water would stay. And in July 1983, the water did something extraordinary. Lake Mead hit 1,225 feet above sea level, its all-time high. The reservoir was so full that water poured over Hoover Dam's side spillways for the first and only time in the dam's history. Aerial photographs from that summer show white cascades thundering from the spillway channels. The lake was at capacity. Full pool is 1,219 feet. The lake was 6 feet above that, pressing against the operational ceiling. It looked to anyone standing on the dam that summer like the most permanent thing in the world. Nobody standing on the rim of Lake Mead in the summer of 1983 had any reason to imagine that within their lifetime, the lake would lose 170 vertical feet of water. The reservoir had been full or near full for most of its existence. Every marina was in the water. Every boat ramp reached the waterline. Every campground was within walking distance of the shore. The infrastructure had been built at the high water mark, and the high water mark was holding. The word drought existed, of course, but it was abstract, something that happened somewhere else, to other rivers, in other centuries. Here is the detail that matters, the one that was invisible at the time. The bathtub ring did not yet exist. The white calcium carbonate stain that would later become the most famous scar in the American West, that bleached band on the canyon walls that marks where the water used to be, was hidden, underwater. You couldn't see it because there was nothing to see. The high water mark and the water were the same line. 20 years later, the ring was impossible to miss. By 2022, it measured 170 feet tall. The megadrought began around the year 2000. Climate scientists believe it may be the worst dry spell to hit the American West in 1,200 years. The snowpack in the Rocky Mountains, the Colorado River's headwaters, started coming in below average, year after year. The river's flow dropped, evaporation increased as temperatures rose, and Lake Mead began to fall. Not dramatically, not all at once. The kind of slow, grinding decline that doesn't lead the evening news because each month's change looks small, a foot here, 18 inches there. But there was something relentless about it. Each spring, the snowmelt was a little less. Each summer, the evaporation was a little more. Each fall, the lake stood lower than it had the year before. The decline was so gradual that for years most visitors didn't notice. The marinas adjusted, the ramps still worked. The water was lower, sure, but it was still there. It was only when you looked at photographs from 2000 next to photographs from 2010 that the change became obvious, and by then the lake had already lost nearly 100 feet. Between 2000 and 2022, the surface of Lake Mead fell more than 170 feet. The shoreline retreated more than 1,000 feet in many areas. Boat ramps that once sloped gently into deep water now ended abruptly in dry sand, hundreds of feet from the waterline. The Park Service scrambled to extend them, hauling in temporary pipe mat ramps and laying them across exposed lake bed. At Hemingway Harbor, crews extended the ramp repeatedly, chasing the retreating water like men building a dock on a lake that was walking away from them. The concessioners tried to adapt. A company called Lake Mead Mojave Adventures introduced MobiMat adaptive launch systems, special mats designed to keep heavy trucks and trailers from sinking into the sand of the exposed lake bed. It was ingenuity born of desperation, building new infrastructure on ground that hadn't been dry in 60 years, not knowing whether the water would keep retreating or suddenly come back. Some ramps couldn't be saved at all. Boulder Harbor was permanently closed. The water had simply left it behind, retreating so far that no extension could reach it. By May 2022, Echo Bay's ramp was shut down, and 5 of the lake's 6 boat ramps were closed. Only Hemingway Harbor remained open. On summer weekends, the wait to launch a boat there stretched to hours. Families sat in line in pickup trucks, trailers hitched behind them, in temperatures that crested 110 degrees. Some gave up. Some drove 2 hours south to Laughlin or Bullhead City to launch on Lake Mojave instead. A senator from Nevada wrote to the Park Service director, "The closures were harming small businesses and workers who depended on Lake Mead tourism for their livelihoods." She used the word crisis. The marinas were suffering worst. Floating docks designed for one water level now sat on mud. Slip rentals dropped. Fuel sales dried up. Houseboat rentals, once the signature Lake Mead experience, entire families living on the water for a week at a time, shrank as the navigable area narrowed and the launching infrastructure collapsed. Businesses in Boulder City, the small gateway community south of the lake, bled revenue year after year. People would come in from the lake and say, "Oh my gosh, this place is a gold mine," one business owner told a reporter. I would just laugh, thinking, if they only knew. The numbers laid it bare. In 2021, Lake Mead drew roughly 7.6 million visitors and ranked 5th among all Park Service sites. 1 year later, in 2022, that number crashed to 5.6 million, a decline of nearly 25%. The park dropped from 5th to 9th on the national list. Visitor spending fell by $94 million in a single year. The number of jobs supported by tourism in communities around the lake fell 25%. The 2022 spending figure was the lowest since 2013, and 2023's visitation of 5.8 million, while slightly up, was, outside of the 2022 collapse, the lowest number since 1982. This happened while the broader national park system was setting records, more than 325 million visits system-wide in 2023. People were traveling. They were visiting parks in record numbers. They just weren't going to Lake Mead. Something about the place had changed, and the change was not subtle. News coverage of the drought, the bodies, the bathtub ring, all of it created a perception that Lake Mead had become bleak, a place defined by loss rather than recreation. Even the Park Service's own former superintendent acknowledged the problem. Alan O'Neill, who had overseen the recreation area when the lake was near its highest levels, told reporters that the visitor experience had been significantly disrupted by the closures. He remembered the park buzzing with activity, boats at every marina, people at every beach, the hum of an economy that ran on water and sunlight. "I feel really bad looking out and seeing that," he said. The economic damage rippled outward from the lake into every business that depended on it. Boat rental companies, bait and tackle shops, gas stations along the road from Las Vegas, restaurants in Boulder City, campground operators, fishing charter captains, tow services. The entire supply chain of a recreation-based economy was built on a resource that was disappearing. Every photograph told the same story. Where NASA satellite images from 2000 showed a deep blue strand of water snaking luxuriously through the Nevada desert, the images from 2022 showed a shrunken, narrow remnant surrounded by wide, pale bands of exposed lake bed. The bathtub ring, that brilliant white mineral stain, banded every canyon wall, every cliff face, every rock formation the lake had once covered. From the air, Lake Mead looked like a body losing weight in the worst possible way, its bones beginning to show. And then the bones were literal. The barrel at Hemingway Harbor was only the beginning. 6 days after that discovery, two sisters from Henderson were paddleboarding in Colville Bay when they spotted something on the exposed bottom. At first, they thought it was a bighorn sheep bone. They dug. It was a human jawbone. Those remains were later identified as Thomas Erndt, a 42-year-old Las Vegas man who had drowned in August 2002 while swimming in the lake. His body had simply stayed where it settled for 20 years until the water peeled back far enough to reveal it. More remains appeared in July 2022 near Swim Beach. More in August. A sixth set in October, again in Colville Bay. Most were not suspicious. Drowning victims from over the years, their resting places exposed by the retreating water, the lake returning what it had taken. But the man in the barrel was different. He had been shot and killed. His body had been placed in a metal container and dumped. The clothing dated to the mid to late 1970s. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Homicide Unit treated it as a murder investigation from the moment they arrived. The gunshot wound was obvious, one detective told reporters. The circumstances were clearly suspicious. The era, the 1970s or early 1980s, placed the killing squarely in the period when organized crime still ran significant operations in Las Vegas. The mob had controlled several major casinos through the 1960s and 1970s, skimming profits, laundering cash, and handling problems in ways that didn't generate paperwork. People who became liabilities sometimes became missing persons, and a lake 112 miles long, in places hundreds of feet deep, surrounded by empty desert, was an extraordinarily convenient place to make someone vanish. The barrel didn't even need to be heavy. It just needed to sink. The water would do the rest, or so whoever dumped it believed. They didn't account for the possibility that 40 years later the water would leave. The FBI created a composite facial reconstruction. It was released in November 2023. No one has been identified. No one has come forward to claim him. Then the war came back, literally rising from the deep. In early July 2022, a World War II-era Higgins landing craft, the type that stormed the beaches at Normandy, surfaced less than a mile from Lake Mead Marina. The boat had been deliberately sunk decades earlier to anchor a breakwater at a depth of 185 feet. Higgins Industries in New Orleans built several thousand of these between 1942 and 1945. Around 1,500 were deployed on D-Day, June 6, 1944. This particular craft was surplus, sold off by the military after the war, used to survey the Colorado River, then purchased by a marina and sunk on purpose. Park Service divers had surveyed the wreck in 2006, when it was still deep enough to require full scuba equipment. 16 years later, it sat two-thirds exposed, its armor plating still intact, baking in the desert air. A boat that helped liberate Europe forgotten at the bottom of a reservoir, given back by a drought. Deeper still and still submerged sits a Boeing B-29 Super Fortress, one of the most important military aircraft ever built. The B-29 program was the single most expensive weapons project of the Second World War, more costly than even the Manhattan Project. On July 21, 1948, at noon, one of these enormous four-engine bombers was conducting atmospheric research over Lake Mead. The plane had been stripped of its weapons and reclassified for scientific work under a project called the High Altitude Flying Laboratory. It carried an instrument called a sun tracker, designed to measure light intensity at various altitudes, including infrared radiation. The mission profile required the aircraft to climb to 30,000 feet over the Grand Canyon and then descend steeply over the lake for low-altitude readings. The surface of Lake Mead that morning was glass calm. There was no wind, no ripple, no visual reference point for a pilot diving toward the water at speed. Captain Robert Madison lost his depth perception. At 230 miles per hour, the B-29 struck the lake, skipped once for about 200 yards, like a stone thrown sidearm, tore off 3 of its 4 engines, and began to settle. The 5-man crew scrambled into 2 life rafts. The sole injury was a broken arm suffered by Staff Sergeant Frank Rico. They floated for 5 hours before Park Service personnel found them by boat and took them to the hospital in Boulder City. The next morning, a plane from the Naval Weapons Station at China Lake flew in to bring them home. The B-29 sank to the bottom of the Overton Arm and was lost for over 50 years. Local divers discovered it in August 2001 using side-scan sonar. It was remarkably intact. Fuselage, tail section, cockpit, sitting about 100 feet underwater, one of the best-preserved B-29 wrecks in the world. It's now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Whether the drought will eventually expose it to open air depends on how much further the water drops. The B-29 is not the only warplane in the lake. In 2007, the Park Service announced the discovery of a PBY Catalina flying boat, a patrol bomber that crashed in 1949, also resting on the lake floor. Lake Mead had become an accidental museum, its artifacts preserved in cold, dark water for decades, slowly being handed back to the surface by a shrinking reservoir. The things the lake kept, the bodies, the boats, the planes, the towns, were never meant to be seen again. That was the whole point of putting them there. The water was supposed to be permanent. And then there was St. Thomas. The town Hugh Lord burned and abandoned in 1938 had briefly resurfaced during earlier droughts. In 1945, again in 1963, only to slip back under the rising water each time. But when the lake fell below 1,070 feet in the early 2000s, St. Thomas came back and stayed. The concrete foundation of the schoolhouse, the crumbling remnants of the Gentry Hotel, the grid of streets that 500 people once walked, all of it exposed, bleached, eroded, but recognizable. A town that existed for 70 years, was drowned for 6 decades, and now sits in the open desert air as if waiting for someone to come back and explain what happened. The irony does not need commentary. The town sacrificed for the lake now outlasts the water that killed it. Visitors hike out to St. Thomas today the way they might visit Pompeii, walking through the remains of a place destroyed not by a volcano, but by a piece of legislation signed in a room 1,000 miles away. The difference is that Pompeii is ancient. St. Thomas is recent enough that some of the people who were born there are still alive. Meanwhile, Las Vegas was planning for a future that didn't include a reliable lake. The city's water managers had been watching the decline since the early 2000s, and in 2005, the Southern Nevada Water Authority approved the construction of a new deep water intake, the Third Straw. The project was one of the most dangerous and expensive tunneling operations in American engineering history. An $817 million bore, 23 feet in diameter, driven 3 miles through solid rock, much of it directly beneath the lake bed of one of the world's largest reservoirs. If the tunnel had breached during construction, the lake could have flooded the entire works. One worker died during the dig. The tunnel took from 2008 to late 2014 to complete. The final breakthrough came when the tunnel boring machine connected with the intake structure 600 feet below the lake bed. They were on target, a spokesman said. They hit the mark right where they wanted to be. The intake taps the lake at 860 feet above sea level, 35 feet below deadpool, the elevation at which water can no longer pass through Hoover Dam at all. The logic was stark. Even in a worst-case scenario, Las Vegas would still be able to pump water from the very bottom of the lake. The third straw was activated in September 2015. Without the third intake, said Pat Mulroy, the longtime head of the Water Authority, southern Nevada would be shutting its doors. In April 2022, that foresight was tested. The lake dropped below 1,050 feet, and intake number 1, the highest of the 3 straws, built decades earlier when nobody imagined the water would fall this far, was left exposed above the waterline. For the first time since the reservoir was filled in the 1930s, Las Vegas's original drinking water pipeline sat in open air. Photographs showed the cylindrical concrete structure sitting on dry lake bed, a piece of critical infrastructure rendered useless by a retreating reservoir. The Water Authority switched entirely to the deeper intakes. Then, in 2023, the authority's board approved $1.4 million to study whether even the third straw would eventually need to be lowered. That question is no longer academic. In the winter of 2022 to 2023, a massive snowpack in the Rocky Mountains sent enough water downstream to nudge the lake up a few feet. It was the first meaningful recovery in years. The reprieve was real and brief. By 2024, the gains had stalled. By 2025, they were eroding. Then 2026 arrived, with one of the lowest snowpacks on record and an extreme heat wave that sent evaporation soaring, and the lake began plummeting again. Between late February and August 2026, Lake Mead lost approximately 1.92 million acre-feet of water, more than the entire annual allocation for the state of Nevada, gone from storage in 6 months. On August 20th, 2026, the lake set a new all-time record low of 1,039.44 feet, breaking the July 2022 record of 1,040.58. Federal modeling projects the decline continuing through the rest of the year. The hydropower cliff is now measured in feet, not abstractions. Hoover Dam has 17 turbines. 12 of them cannot operate when the lake drops below 1,035 feet. That is roughly 4 feet from where the water sits right now. If the lake crosses that line, and federal projections suggest it could within months, 70% of Hoover Dam's generating capacity disappears. Below 950 feet, power generation stops entirely. Below 895 feet, deadpool, water can no longer physically pass through the dam. No gravity deliveries to Arizona, no deliveries to California, no deliveries to Mexico. The dam becomes a wall with a lake behind it that has no outlet. That phrase, deadpool, has become the term that appears in every headline, the scenario that every water manager in the Southwest is now calculating against. It does not mean the lake would be empty. Even at deadpool, Lake Mead would still hold water. But it would be water with no outlet, trapped behind a dam that could no longer deliver it. The legal rights would still exist on paper: Arizona's allocation, California's allocation, Mexico's treaty guarantee. But a legal entitlement cannot move water through an intake that sits above the surface of the lake. Senior rights holders would retain their claims. The physical system would simply be unable to honor them. The Bureau of Reclamation has begun emergency triage. In April 2026, it transferred water from Flaming Gorge Reservoir in Utah and held back flows from Lake Powell, to keep that upstream reservoir above its own minimum power pool of 3,490 feet. Both of the two largest reservoirs in the country are now in emergency. The 7 Colorado River Basin states are negotiating a short-term agreement on water cuts. But the deeper reckoning, how to divide a river that carries significantly less water than the law promises, remains unresolved. Under the 1922 Compact, the states still legally count on divvying up 15 million acre-feet annually. The actual average flow since 2000 has been about 12.4 million. Nobody is getting what the compact promised. Some researchers have begun to question whether the word drought is even accurate anymore. What if the wet period of the 20th century, the period during which every major piece of water infrastructure in the West was designed, built, and calibrated, was the anomaly? What if the arid conditions of the 21st century are not a temporary deviation, but a return to the long-term mean? Tree ring studies suggest that the medieval period saw dry spells in this region lasting decades, even centuries. If that is the baseline, then the Colorado River was never as generous as the compact assumed. The reservoirs were never going to stay full, and every city, farm, marina, and fishing charter built on the assumption of abundant water was built on a mirage. The men in Santa Fe in 1922 didn't just divide the river too generously. They may have been measuring a river that was, at that exact moment in history, performing at the top of its range, and they locked those peak numbers into law. A century later, the lake they built to store the surplus is showing its ribs. Lake Mead today is about 25% full. Hoover Dam's hydropower output is expected to drop 40% this year. The white bathtub ring around the reservoir is wider than it has ever been, a visible geological record of every year the water fell, every promise the river couldn't keep. For every 1% the reservoir drops, University of Arizona research found, visitation falls 5%. The math is relentless. The water leaves, the visitors leave, the businesses close, the economy contracts, and the landscape itself becomes harder to look at. Tour operators in Las Vegas are quietly shifting their itineraries. More desert hiking, more aerial sightseeing, the dam as a history lesson rather than the backdrop to a weekend on the water. In August 2026, more human remains were found at Boulder Beach, the latest in a pattern that shows no sign of ending as long as the water keeps dropping. Every foot the lake loses reveals new lake bed that hasn't seen air in decades. Nobody knows what else is down there. Nobody can know. At Boulder Beach, where families once spread towels near the waterline, the walk to the water is now a long hike across exposed lake bed. The bleached canyon walls carry the record of every year the lake has fallen. Near Hemingway Harbor, the asphalt of a parking lot ends abruptly where a marina once met the water. Below the pavement, cracked mud stretches toward a distant, diminished shoreline. And 60 miles to the east, the ruins of St. Thomas stand in open air. The foundations of the schoolhouse, the walls of the Gentry Hotel, the streets Hugh Lord walked the night he struck the match. The town has been above water now for more than 2 decades, the longest stretch since it was drowned in 1938. If the projections hold, if the snowpack stays thin, if the heat keeps building, St. Thomas may never go back under. The white ring around Lake Mead is wider this summer than it has ever been. It is still growing.